Okay, perfect. So, good afternoon, everyone. It is a great pleasure to welcome you to this EvoKE webinar and to introduce our speaker today, Maria João Fonseca. Maria João is Head of Communication at the Natural History and Science Museum of the University of Porto and the Director of the Hall of Biodiversity, which is a science center, and she also plays a leading role at the European level as president of the EXCITE, the European Association of Science Centers and Museums. And Maria João has background in animal biology, in biology teaching, and a PhD in science education and communication. Her career has been strongly shaped by the connection between science, education, and society. In her current role, she is responsible for coordinating and promoting science communication and outreach activities, engaging a wide range of audience. And she has been deeply involved in the design and evaluation of educational activities in both formal and also non-formal settings, including teacher training and public engagement initiatives. And she's also an invited professor at the Faculty of Science of the University of Porto, where she teaches biology didactics and contributes to the education of future teachers. And her main interests include the intersection of art and science in promoting scientific culture and well-being, science education in non-formal environments, particularly more museums and science centers, and active learning methodologies and the evaluation of the impact of these educational experience. So we are truly delighted to have such an inspiring voice in science communication with us today. So Maria João, thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for being here, and the floor is yours.
So hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here, and I really, really appreciate the invitation. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how museums and science centers can boost evolution education across Europe, but taking on a pan-European approach. Let's see if I can share my slides. I think you are seeing them, and let's see if I can put up the presenter's view. Okay, so starting off, we would say that evolution education takes up a very relevant role in formal environments, but also in informal settings. And science museums and science centers in particular are very, very relevant venues for non-formal science education, besides obviously informal science education as well and other sorts of education. These institutions can address relevant topics amongst many other more baseline contents, but issues like evolution, climate change, biodiversity loss, sustainability, and restorative practices can and are being widely addressed in these settings. And one of the benefits that they have in what comes to formal education environments is that they allow us to reach audiences who may not encounter these contents elsewhere, that have already addressed some of the contents during their formal education or are not in contact with them in their regular daily lives. Science centers and museums do play a crucial role in evolution education, mainly by fostering public understanding of evolution theory and principles as well, as they employ innovative approaches to address challenges like skepticism and science denial, and allow to promote scientific literacy. So most museums and science centers are moving on from static displays of contents, of objects, of collections, to more engaging, or to becoming more engaging and learner-centered environments. So we expect that these places, these settings, allow for interaction to be fostered, along as sparking curiosity in order to promote education, even though some of them may not present themselves as in education settings per se, because they do have a wider scope. But in the particular context of this talk, we are focusing on the educational potential of these environments. Amongst the many initiatives that they can promote, we have activities, educational activities, we have interactive exhibits or exhibitions themselves, we have evidence-based programs. These are spaces in which dialogue is valued and promoted, of course. We have something happened to my presentation, sorry. We have a sense of community, building up community and taking advantage of the framing within community of practices and within co-creation programs. We can promote authentic experiences by harnessing the potential of science, research, scientific research, and bringing it into the museum setting. They are ideal places to address social scientific issues and STEM approaches, and most of them are now operating as active learning sites, so placing the participants in the center of their experience, be that a learning one or another sort of experience. These are spaces in which public understanding of evolutionary, as I mentioned, theory and principles can be fostered, and by allowing to address issues like the ones mentioned here, they can indeed allow us to step further and to promote a capacity to apply the knowledge that is being produced. Obviously, most of this working in close collaboration with formal education. I'm with the environmental today, but with education settings. So science centers and museums are indeed spaces for inquiry and reasoning. They allow us to develop critical thinking by guiding learners to reason about processes that have to do with, in this case, evolution and with change, and drawing conclusions or allowing them to draw conclusions from evidence and not just a simple memorization of facts. We are more concerned with the mobilization and the application of knowledge. Most of these spaces do offer visitor-centered experiences, and the aim is always to spark curiosity, to foster social interaction between the participants and the visitors themselves, between the visitors and the displays with which they are interacting, between the visitors and the explainers and the other elements that compose the groups they are included in. And often we do provide, as already mentioned, authentic and evidence-based interactions. Science centers and museums are increasingly facilitating hands-on activity that encourage visitors to build up and to propose hypotheses about evolutionary events and also explore, so putting them in contact with real evolutionary evidence. And most of them, the ones that deal specifically with evolution or that address evolution not from a baseline structure, but eventually convey concepts that are related to evolution, they tend to incorporate analogical and digital solutions to visualize complex ideas like phylogeny, and the most typical example are phylogenetic trees. That can be, as seen in this slide, physical structures or made available in a digital environment. And they value interactive exhibits, so favoring, again, hands-on activity, but from both mechanical and digital viewpoint. But the idea here is that they have the potential to model real scientific research, allowing to investigate issues like evolutionary change in diverse species and in complex environments, often by simulating phenomena like natural selection and sexual selection and whatnot. In many cases, we do see long-form exhibitions and object-based interpretation, meaning that museums do have the potential to use that heritage and their collections in service of education. So most of them are organizing exhibits or exhibitions with fossils, with dioramas, with skeletal casts, and sometimes original skeletons, and also multimedia in combination with these objects to illustrate phylogeny, deep time, process of speciation and adaptation. And this has the potential to be even more authentic since we are dealing with specimens that are real or artifacts, let's say. They often resort to active learning and to games and simulations, creating environments that can be more motivating for younger generations and even for not so young generations. Sometimes they do use role play, simulations, interactive games to model phenomena like natural, again, sexual or artificial selection, genetic drift, competition, many of these events and processes allowing learners to manipulate variables, so investing in experimental work, and allowing them to see or forecast potential outcomes. It's not me so someone turned on their microphone. So when it comes to digital learning, museums are also investing in open resources and virtual workshops. So it's not just the experience that takes place within the museum setting. So most of them are trying to transpose this interaction with their audiences in digital environments and make available a lot of digital tools, virtual labs, streamed workshops, most like this one, interactive web resources, and open access image or collection databases to support classroom work. So again, working in close collaboration with formal settings, but with other sorts of institutions and entities as well. The idea is to foster remote learning about evolution as much as possible. When it comes to community engagement, it's key for museums as cultural entities to establish collaborations and partnerships with schools, with local, regional, or international communities in order to tailor or better adapt programs, the activities that they promote, and to ensure the relevance, the authenticity, the meaningfulness, and relatedness of the experiences they provide with diverse or specific audiences. And so they do the same in what comes to evolution. It's very important to notice that many of these museums and science centers are promoting curriculum length and age-targeted workshops that teach variation, natural selection, again, fossil evidence. So the issues can be almost as many as we would like to address, and the museums have the potential to address them using the channels and the tools that they have access to. Capacitation also and professional development. Museums are providing seminars, courses, and resources, not just for students, so they may not target directly their end users, or at times they may allow their end users to be the teachers, so mediators, educators that can then boost and expand on the potential of the initiatives that they foster. And of course, allowing these participants to come in contact with state-of-the-art, very up-to-date content about these issues. And often they do seek alignment with curricula, but with other guidelines that may be relevant for their participants. Usually, and when we are happy enough to see that this is happening more frequently, we notice that museums and science centers are assuming evolution, or are concerned about evolution from an institutional point of view. So they do incorporate the concern about addressing evolution education in their mission, in their vision, their values. And sometimes when going through guidelines, regulations, and more formal documentation, we do see a concern to address evolution education, and this is happening ever more frequently. Of course, we couldn't avoid talking about citizen science and the connections, the direct connections to research that are particularly important when it comes to these contents. And some institutions are connecting visitors to active research using their collections and their staff expertise to show science in practice. This is the case with iNaturalist and other platforms, collaborative platforms, that put citizens in contact with scientists and the scientific community. And the data that can be retrieved from these repositories is a resource, a very important resource to address evolution. Sometimes they do base their action also in role model-based learning, meaning that by putting the participants and their visitors in contact with scientists, actual evolutionary biologists, they are able to show these specialists, these experts, as role models, so that they can not only show or tell about the science behind evolution, but also about the process through which science is being produced, and humanizing also the production of knowledge in this scope. So bridging even more tightly the gap between these two segments of society. Nowadays, Nowadays, more intensely, but this is a trend that is actually not new. But museums do resort to narrative and storytelling quite a lot, creating fictional narratives and sometimes using true settings and true stories that can be used to make complex concepts more accessible to diverse audiences. They also tend to rely on inter and multidisciplinarity, serving as incubators for innovation and creativity by bridging or by bringing together and fostering dialogue from different areas of knowledge, including arts, literature, technology, history, to broaden the impact of evolution education. So they tend not to stick to the natural science field itself, but they tend to value the intersection with other contents coming from other disciplines. And they also try to incorporate as much as possible the issues that they address and the experiences they provide with contemporary and daily life issues. So linking evolution to relevant topics such as health, environmental change, can increase the engagement of the participants by allowing them to understand how evolution can be applied on a regular, day-to-day, everyday life basis. And this is very important as we know. They also try to value the connection between new information and visitors' prior knowledge and use examples that are relevant. But obviously, this demands a knowledge of their audiences, and so the depth and diversity of experiences that museums and science centers are able to provide in this scope may vary. But a very paradigmatic case is the case of antibiotic resistance that is increasingly being addressed in many museums. Often, it is true that some museums may induce misconceptions, but often they try to counteract misconceptions and to address them by fostering dialogue and facilitating discussions and serving as spaces that change visitors' preconceptions by providing often quite emotionally loaded experiences that confront visitors with their pre-existing knowledge in relation to evolution in this case, but to many other concepts. And the goal, of course, is to foster critical thinking, and especially in what comes to human evolution and the way that it is addressed in formal education. So trying to advance a bit further the knowledge basis that we build through our formal education. They, as much as possible, rely on conflict-reducing approaches. So the goal is not to induce conflict, but rather not to avoid it, but try to prevent it. So it's to present the content that relates, in this case, to evolution in a way that is clearly linked with the scientific research that is being provided and developed. So museums tend to avoid or prevent conflicts that have to do with the value system and with the other sorts of perceptions and the way they are modeled by other elements that divert from the scientific field. So that we can allow visitors to understand the mechanisms of evolution without necessarily having them accept evolution. So these are two different dimensions, as research now clearly shows, and as we all know. But museums are not really concerned with building the capacity to accept evolution. The idea is to understand evolution and to understand how it operates regularly. And this is a current trend in the way museums and science centers operate. They try to facilitate conversations about evolution, especially in areas that relate directly or more directly to human evolution. Okay. Also, through the discussion of evolution-related topics, many museums try to provide inclusive framing and contextualization. So it is possible to address human values and humane values to make learning more inclusive and culturally sensitive by pairing scientific content with discussions about ethics, human diversity, and bringing in local perspectives. So it's just making meaning out of evolutionary concepts on a social and humane ambience and environment. When possible, museums do try to integrate evolution across diverse exhibitions. So in some cases, you may go to a museum and you may face yourself with a given exhibit or module that addresses evolution, or a temporary exhibition, or a workshop or an activity. But many museums are investing in presenting evolution in a more longitudinal way, in a more transversal way along the set of exhibits that make up their even long-standing or permanent exhibitions. So even though the idea of a single evolution hall still exists, we tend to see evolution being incorporated and infused along the various contents in which a museum's permanent exhibition is structured. And sometimes, and this is an increasingly relevant trend, fortunately, we do see or we do witness an effort in monitoring the effectiveness of these initiatives based on visitors' feedback and also on learning outcomes, namely in collaboration with other agents and institutions that can assist museums. Because you see, in a museum, the experience that is provided is disrupted by the absence from the museum. So it takes place in a very or in a more episodic manner. So you would need consistently that museum visitors return to the museum. And this happens in a lot of educational programs, but not always, and not for single visits. So sometimes it is important, I would say all of the time, it's much more important or the impact that we can get from engaging in collaboration, it's much more relevant and it's higher than if we just do things individually, but museums often resort to their partners. As for impact, well, museum visits, as shown by research, can indeed improve the understanding of evolutionary concepts. They can allow to reduce creationism and intuitive reasoning, and they can enhance knowledge of the history of life. But the goal is always to allow their visitors and the participants in the activities they promote to make informed decision-making in their daily lives using evolutionary knowledge. In what comes to interest and engagement, well, museum visits and programs can increase participants' momentary but also stable interest in evolution. It depends obviously on the features and on the profiles of the participants, but it also depends on the sort of activities and experiences that are provided. Usually they do so by promoting participatory and narrative-driven experiences, and also by fostering active engagement. And if we go to the literature, we will find a plethora and an increasing number of papers that show how museums' visitors' interest can be boosted when they interact with different displays. And obviously, and this is just an example that I brought, in some cases, museums do resort to blockbusters. For younger generations, this expression may not be as relevant, but popular objects, popular characters, popular stories. For instance, dinosaurs always have a big impact whenever people are thinking about exhibitions. You also see various representations of human evolution. So this will modulate, in a way, it will determine the interest that the participants may have in a given exhibition. And at times, it is important, obviously, to call attention and to have visitors hooked on a given topic, but then the goal is to allow them to become more interested in a long-lasting fashion. So even when they leave the museum, it's important that we do witness a certain amount of interest that allows visitors to search for information elsewhere about evolution and its related topics. But on average, we do tend to see that a visit to a natural history museum can increase this idea, this momentary interest in evolution. And it's also interesting to see that students whose state-like interest could be triggered, so the ones that are prone to become interested in evolution by visiting a museum, by taking part in a tour, tend to report better grades or at least better knowledge in biology-related issues. So this allowing them to build up on their interest by seeing the positive impact that addressing these topics may have. And the results also demonstrate that in this particular study that I showed, that students were more activated when provided a certain level of open-mindedness. So it's not just guiding them clearly and very directed towards a given line of reasoning. It's allowing them to be critical and to open up their views when addressing these issues. We also see that there's a lot of content that is being brought into museums in what comes to evolution. And for instance, in this study, we went, or the researchers went to the Book of Visitors. And it's true that when presenting evolution-related contents, the number of visitors to this particular museum increased. So again, showing that evolution can be a topic of interest. And also that conscious changes of ideas and approaches, of attitudes and interest in Charles Darwin, because obviously is one, I wouldn't say he's a dinosaur, but he's a very popular figure in calling attention towards evolution. So many people do know the name of Charles Darwin, even though they may not really understand fully the concept of evolution, but they have the name present in their mind. And this opens up possibilities for their interest to be built around evolutionary related topics. And so in this particular situations, they use this to document test answers and conversations that the students had during their classes. And they noticed that there was an increase in the interest shown by students, and also in the use of keywords and key concepts. So this was documented following a visit to a museum in which they were addressing evolution-related topics. The difference between acceptance and understanding. So museum visitors are generally more accepting of evolution than the broader public, even though, again, as I mentioned, the goal here is to allow an understanding of evolution that can be mobilized and applied. But regardless of this, we see that many of them, even the ones who are more accepting, struggle with core processes like natural selection and speciation. So we don't want acritical acceptors of evolution. We want people to use evolution. That's the work that museums are doing. But acceptance does seem to be particularly influenced by education, values, and religious background. And we see that there are a lot of elements that contribute to levels of acceptance, and not all of them can be addressed by a museum, and I would argue not even by a formal education setting. And knowledge and understanding seems to be more closely tied to educational interventions. These are the ones that we can more easily modulate and act upon. When it comes to museums, visitors' understandings of evolution, this is just an example. I brought these statements that I found very, very interesting. So one of the statements read, "I don't believe in evolution. The dinosaurs live with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and then the aliens came and gave us fire and the wheel." So this is, I don't even know if this is true or this was just a joke that someone wrote, but you have a comment that brings all sorts of information together in I would say a soup of ideas. But in other cases, you see statements like, "I don't believe in all in evolution. It seems to clash much with religious beliefs, but I do believe in some of it." So there are some elements that I can incorporate and integrate in my own structures, cognitive structures, and I can use it. But what do most scientists believe? And this leads us to think about the idea of trust in information sources and scientific authority. So all of these issues are being studied in museums and can modulate the experience that the visitors have and then the knowledge that is built about evolution. And then you have other views, like it's obvious that evolution exists. In this case, I completely accept it. I'm not entirely sure if I understand it, but what do you tell to people who say it doesn't exist? So if I accept it, but I cannot explain it, how can I lead other people to be accepting? So you have all this diversity of reactions. But when it comes to the comparison with the general public, we see that museum visitors are more likely to endorse evolution as an explanation of human origin. However, they are still more likely to endorse creationism as opposed to, in what comes to humans, as opposed to non-human species. The majority of museum visitors continues to hold misconceptions about evolution. We do see that, and most have difficulties in accurately explaining fundamental evolutionary mechanisms. And this is documented in this paper, but in a lot of studies. And museum visitors are not solely creationists, novice naturalists. So these are just descriptions and classifications of the knowledge that museum visitors may have and acceptance levels, or evolutionary reasoners, but rather they combine elements of these three reasoning patterns depending on the situation. So things aren't as clear as say, I'm completely opposed to evolution. I don't understand evolution. I completely accept it. I understand everything. So it's just an amalgam, and also depends on the topics that are being addressed, and not exclusively on the profile of the visitors and on the quality or type of interaction. In this other paper, researchers were talking about a conceptual guide to natural history museum visitors' understanding of evolution, and what they found out was this. This is just a representation of the structure that they encountered. And this explains a little bit of those reasoning patterns. So when dealing with intuitive reasoning, you can classify, this is just a classification, but you can classify, or at least allow the emergence of reasoning patterns that we can describe as being novice naturalist reasoners, informed naturalistic reasoners, or creationist reasoners. And this obviously may vary if you are talking about a more religious perspective or a more scientific driven perspective. But what this means is that when we go, for instance, to informed naturalistic reasoner, they do have some understanding of key evolutionary concepts. When you are dealing with novice naturalistic reasoners, they also have some understanding of key evolutionary concepts, but they bring in more intuitive explanations. And when we are dealing with creationist reasoners, in this case, they tend to resort to supernatural explanations. But to show that things aren't as clear as to allow us, obviously this is a Venn diagram, so this shows that there's overlap between these reasoning patterns. But what these data showed is that 72% of the people responding to or taking part in this study did bring in elements of these two different reasoning patterns, while 28 actually were able to integrate elements from the three. So again, showing that there's no clear distinction and definite classification in a black and white fashion in what comes to the way in which we can describe the reasoning that goes on when participants are faced with evolution-related topics. Another study focusing on the understanding about evolution. In this particular case, researchers showed that 95% of the participants in this study understood relative geological time, while only 30% explained biological change in terms of natural selection, and only 11% explicitly rejected evolution. So things are, we may be optimistic in what comes to the way in which many museum visitors are engaging with this topic. But even though people tend to have some reasoning, some degree of reasoning about evolution and the capacity to apply these concepts, we do see that most times the knowledge and the understanding of evolution concepts is incomplete. So allowing us to think that it is important to carry on investing in evolution education, of course. And when we are thinking about, and this is a very interesting study matter as well, predictors of evolution acceptance in the museum population. So in a multivariate model, and this was the main these were the main findings of the study, knowledge of evolution terms can be predicted by education and religious denomination. And in a similar model, acceptance of evolution can be predicted by education, by religious denomination, but also by frequency of church attendance and knowledge of evolution terms. So more active habits and also capacity to mobilize information and knowledge. And the results from this study were consistent with previous findings in samples from the US that demonstrated that religious denomination, religiosity, and education can be predictors of evolutionary acceptance among adults. And in addition, they confirm the hypothesis that these researchers put forward that religion and education represent largely distinct pathways in the acceptance of evolution. The major impact of religious denomination is on the acceptance and not the knowledge of evolution. So again, we can clearly see that these are two separate fields that when addressing and when building up knowledge about evolution, people have the capacity to work through in different ways and of integrate in distinct fashion. This is another very interesting study in which we were, or the researchers were looking into the conversations about evolution during family visits to an exhibition about Darwin. And this took place in the Mexican Museum. And so the researchers were concerned about the scientific reasoning that emerged from the interaction of these family groups with the exhibition. And again, the results are consistent with what I have been showing until now. We do see that there's a tendency for people to mobilize sort of evolutionary reasoning, and this happened in around 30% of the cases that were documented. And of course, this has to do with the capacity to think about variation, think about inheritance, common descendants, selection processes. People are able to mobilize and think about time and the scales of time and the time it takes for evolutionary processes to take place. Also thinking about ecological pressures. But almost the same amount of people, a little bit higher even, 34%, were relying on intuitive reasoning to make sense of the contents they were interacting with. So they were talking about intentionality, adaptation that is goal-directed, adaptations that are static and that do not evolve, and then making a lot of analogies and comparisons that at some points may be useful. In others, they just create disruption. And thinking about causes that are in direct proximity with the events taking place. But again, another third, and say these are just very few percentage points, but another third actually combined these lines of reasoning. So backing up this notion that making sense of anything in evolution, which is a very complex and abstract notion and concept and system, brings in or demands bringing in elements from different lines of reasoning. This other study, making an impression. Here, researchers were thinking about students who attended informal evolution enrichment programs, and this was not simply a visit to a museum. This was an educational program. Were they able to recall their experience 3 years from the moment in which they engaged in this program? So there was a sentence there, just calling attention to the fact that informal evolution education programs can have lasting effects. And so the study, in a given way, demonstrates just that. So they examined sixth grade students' conceptualization of evolutionary ideas following 4 extracurricular evolution-themed science days at Nature Campus. This is an informal learning environment that employed a combination of resources, including fossils, so again, real objects, as well as the contact with the natural environments in zoos and in what comes to zoological and botanical specimens. And so what they noticed is that Many of the elements that the students came across when immersed in these experiences were retained afterwards, emphasizing the contribution of its features as an authentic learning environment that uses visualization, manipulation, so hands-on activities, and interactive and inquiry-based practices. So sometimes it's not just the content itself, it's the way in which the content is worked through that museums have to offer and that can contribute to this learning and retention. They also noticed that changes in the prominence and complexity of certain constructs that may reflect the nature of the relationship between what the students learn and the informal environment of these nature campus have the potential to foster what is being taught in the formal environment. Again, emphasizing this idea that we already have, that is important for museums when thinking about their programming and the activities they provide, to work closely with partners that can include the formal settings. Another study over here. We are thinking about changing museums' visitors' conceptions of evolution. And so in this particular study, researchers show that a single visit to an interactive exhibition on evolution can have a positive impact through incremental change in the understanding of evolution, regardless of the beliefs, interests, or age of the visitors. I cannot go into much detail on the kind of experiences that were being provided, but it's just to give you an idea that sometimes this may happen if we have an impactful enough exhibition or activity. So, summing up, while museum-based programs can enhance public understanding of evolution, the impact is generally incremental and varies individual to individual and setting by setting. So museums can foster interest and can improve knowledge. Conceptual change, we do know, is challenging, and misconceptions often persist, regardless of the investment that the museum may have in addressing them. And misconceptions, in particular about evolution, remain widespread among visitors regardless of their educational background. And there's a resilience in intuitive reasoning, because it can be boosted after the experience of being immersed in the immersion experience in the museum, in our interaction in day-to-day situations, in everyday situations. So, for instance, these researchers were thinking about museums' visitors' use of key concepts and misconceptions in written explanation, in written explanations of evolutionary scenarios. So they presented their visitors or the participants in this activity with evolutionary scenarios, and then they were worried and concerned about the concepts that they mobilized in trying to make sense out of them. And the frequency of misconceptions, we noticed, or they noticed, that there's a tendency for theological explanations, so the idea that evolution has a purpose, that there's an intention in a given change. This is a prevalent concept appearing in almost half of the participants. From this essentialism, the belief that traits are inherent to a given species, and intentionality, the idea that organisms have specific intentions for change, they are the ones mobilizing and organizing this evolution, their own evolution. This happened in almost 20% of all participants. Okay, and we are thinking about the capacity to adapt and make acclimatation, so acclimatize, and changes in individual versus population level. It is very frequent for people to think that evolution operates in single individual organisms, and so these ideas are prevalent regardless of or sometimes even regardless of the experiences that are provided. So this was overall a general, more theoretical or research-based overview of how evolution education is being addressed and can be studied in museum environments. But I would also like to call attention to some case studies. So bringing in some examples of museums all around the world, mostly Europe, but others that are abroad. So the first example I bring you is in France, in Paris. Natural History Museum of Paris. So this is emblematic. It's their evolution hall. So they have a collection of specimens from different taxonomic groups organized in this massive hall. And they present, the description is lovely. They mention that they don't speak, but they tell you everything about life. They are 7,000 specimens in the Grande Galerie de l'Evolution, sorry for my French, a mythical place that opened in 1994 where modernity meets history and science to tell the story of the great adventure of biodiversity. Even though you may think that this is a very classical display, and it is, in a way, from a museographic point of view, it allows to address the idea of evolution, of how all of these animals in these taxonomic groups are related to a common ancestor. And so just by being immersed in this environment, you are faced with a concept of evolution. But more than that, more than having a static display of how evolution can allow us to explain with what we now see in what comes to the diversity of life, they also invest in a lot of activities, and this is just a map of the museum, focusing on evolution-related topics, even though they are not worried or may not be worried in addressing evolution per se, using the specific term. Again, they infuse their actions with evolution, which is very, very interesting and also powerful. The group that makes up the Natural History Museum, the National Natural History Museum in Paris, also has the Jardin des Plantes, which is a botanical garden, of course, and it has the potential to allow us to address evolution in any way we see fit in what comes to the plant world. But it is interesting to see that in this particular case, they brought in the tree of life, so a phylogenetic tree, in their first permanent virtual reality room. So here you have a very technologically driven element that allows us to interact directly with the idea of evolution within a more traditional setting and a more natural setting. So technology coming together with a natural environment. And they call it Journey into the Heart of Evolution, which is very, very interesting, I found. Also part of this group is the Musée de l'Homme. So here they are focusing on human evolution, the gallery of mankind. So here, of course, like in many other museums, we are addressing evolution, but we are focusing on the human scenario, okay? We do know that the way in which human evolution is being portrayed, and it's still being portrayed in many settings as being a linear process, is completely, it makes no sense in what comes to the data we are able to collect from the fossil record and from the archaeological record as well. And so many museums are using their collections to tell a different story, a story that is more compatible with the evolution of other living beings on Earth and the evolution we are now also witnessing. Then we move on to the Natural History Museum. We are now in the UK. And in this case, I bring you the example of the From the Beginning gallery. So here they are interested in exploring the evolution of life on our planet, of course, from the beginning. So they present a longitudinal step-by-step guide as to how life is evolving in our planet. And so they use, again, real objects, real specimens to tell this story, which is always very enticing. They also have human evolution on display, and they have what they call star specimens and exhibits. They have Neanderthal remains. They have a lot of real and very impactful objects that they use to convey information of human evolution, but integrated in a wider depiction of the evolution of life, which is also very interesting. And again, they also have a garden, which is very interesting. It's just outside the building of the museum. And they have what they call an evolution garden. And now they are addressing evolution from a geological point of view. So it's the substract of life. They bring in their new, it opened recently, evolution garden, rocks, fossils, and then again, of course, plants and sculptures, so some artifacts that tell the story of evolution through geological time, which is very, very enticing and relaxing, because you are in the city center and you are in the garden about to see one of the main and biggest museums in Europe, and so you can rest while being submersed and immersed in evolution. Another interesting example is this evolution workshop. So even though some museums do invest a lot in their permanent exhibitions and permanent spaces, and this is very challenging, of course, they don't stop there. So they try to diversify their audiences and to work with their audiences these complex notions and very abstract contents by also investing in programming. So here is just an example of one of the workshops that the Natural History Museum is making available. Okay, and this is an on-site workshop because, as already mentioned, sometimes they transfer these contents to a digital environment as well. Still in the UK, we go to the Oxford University Museum of Natural History. Of course, their collection and even their logo has the dodo, which, as you know, is extinct, and it's a very, very interesting and sad, of course, example of how a species is no longer. And so they were able to, in a very, very special place, because the Oxford Museum of Natural History is built on inside a building that was thought from the beginning, like much what happened in London, to become a natural history museum. So the space itself, its architecture is filled with references to natural history, botany, and zoology. So you have that immersion, but at the same time, you have the feeling of entering in a classical setting, in a typical museum setting that you are expecting to witness. What they were able to do, and this opened just a few years ago, was to revise their main hall and to include some displays in which they address evolution, adaptation, geodiversity, but with a more arts and science feeling. So more, I wouldn't say sophisticated, because there's a lot of complexity going on in that museum, so everything is sophisticated, but in a more modern way, that I would say. So you have the conflict between the modern and the historical, and this is very emotionally charged, allowing visitors to become more interested again in these topics. And also, again, Evolution Revolution, it's a cool name for a workshop. They have programs in which they address specifically evolution, and these are included in their programming. Here, they interweave these concepts with games. In this particular situation, these were like board games, so more classical, making a comeback now, and so calling attention to other segments of their audiences, and again, diversifying and exposing a wider number of participants to these concepts. Now here, we are still in the UK, and we are in the Great North Museum in Manchester, and this is a cool exhibition. It's an introduction, as they say, to human evolution. They call it 99% ape. And this is very interesting because of the misconceptions of all humans deriving from apes and not from a common ancestor. So they address all of this. They call it Human Odyssey, in which they explore themes of common ancestry. So this is pretty much an initiative built around this misconception and allowing us to address it by being allowed to interact with evidence and with objects that show us how we believe nowadays, based on the evidence that we have, that evolution took place. Another example, and now we change continents and we go to Brazil. It's the traits of evolution, marcas de evolução in Portuguese. In this particular situation, I brought it here because this is an example of collaboration. So it is an exhibition based on a phylogenetic tree, a big tree of life, and they are talking about the evolution of life on Earth. But this this exhibition in itself came about as the collaborative effort of both Museu de Ciências e Tecnologia, so the museum in Brazil, and the Great North Museum. So even though we have two different continents, we are not apart, and people can collaborate, and sometimes they do so on the benefit of evolution education. This is a very cool example that I wanted to show you. Museum. I have just recently been to this museum last week. It's an amazing museum, and the way in which they organize their permanent exhibition, it's very, very interesting because they are valuing what makes them unique in what comes to mountain ecosystems. They are surrounded by mountains. The museum takes on the example of the mountain, but then they organize the elements, especially in the first floor, according to an evolutionary underpinning. And there you can find evolution of other animals, of plants, but also evolution of humans, using the mountain metaphor, which is very, very interesting. And no, it doesn't direct us towards misconceptions that evolution is progress, not necessarily, or at least not making or allowing newcomers to become more perfect than their old timers. Now we go to Berlin, and we are thinking about evolution in action. This is the permanent exhibition in the Natuurkunde Museum, so the Natural History Museum. And here we are presented with a massive, magnificent display of objects from all taxonomic groups, organized according to their diversity. And we are thinking about how a new species evolved. So we are thinking about speciation, of how continuously every living being on Earth, every population, every species is subject to evolutionary forces and is changing. And we can learn about this by looking into some of the most beautiful specimens that exist in Europe. This is a lovely collection. Another very interesting museum in the Netherlands now is the Naturalis Museum. So they have one of the top 5 collections, natural history collections, and they use their objects to tell stories about many issues, but some of them, and most of them, are related to evolution. Even though they present this part of the museum that I'm showing in this slide as the evolutionary gallery, they are talking about plants, animals, fungi, all life, and the way in which life is related and is evolving in our planet. Truth be told, is that they infuse every single bit in their museum with evolution. Take, for instance, seduction. Seduction is sexual selection, but they called it this fancy name that calls attention to the phenomena. But across every single part of the museum, you will find evolution. As I was mentioning, a very powerful way to address the concepts. Now we are in Spain, and we are in the Museum of Human Evolution. And again, this is more thematic in what comes to the type of evolution. We are talking specific, or the subject of evolution. We are talking on evolution of humans. And in their permanent exhibition, they again are concerned about how humans, as humans, have been evolving. But if we go, for instance, to Germany and to the Neanderthal Museum, another lovely, very, very interesting museum built around the story of Neanderthals, you will find a permanent exhibition in which people can actually touch and experience the direct hands-on interaction with the specimens. They bring in mammoths, which are very popular, much like dinosaurs. So they use these anchors to engage visitors of all ages with evolution-related topics. Another very, very interesting museum, now in Denmark, is the Mosgaard Museum. So this is the Stairway of Evolution. The Stairway of Evolution depicts evolution, human evolution in this case, but us visitors are there walking through the staircase. It's an actual staircase you can use to go from one floor to another, but you are traveling along the history of your own life as a human being and as a living being evolving in this planet. And they have this very, very interesting concept of arts and science, in which they were, this is one of my favorite, I wouldn't call it diorama, it's not really a diorama, but it's an installation in which they establish a comparison between cranium and between skull and even brain. And they bring in these sculptures made by 2 brothers, Canis and Canis, 2 artists, that represent, here you obviously cannot, you need to trust my word for it, you cannot tell, but these elements of the human family are represented with features and with expressions that we can see in modern humans, which is very, very interesting, because it shows us that our ancestors and the hominids that have been occupying and existing in our planet have reactions that are identical to ours. So from an empathic point of view, this also brings the visitors closer to this idea of tree of evolution and not linear evolution. And they do this in a very spectacular and elegant way. Musée des Confluences, we now go to France again. And I'm talking about or highlighting the origins stories of the world. So this is part of their permanent exhibition, and they are concerned of these issues. Where do we come from? Of course, from a more philosophical point of view, but also from the point of view of evolution. We are thinking about the origin, but regardless of the origin, how do we came here to the time being? How have we've been evolving? And again, they use lovely objects displayed in very, very interesting and appealing ways to tell this story. Then we go to the USA again, and we go to the Field Museum, and there's no question here. We cannot argue with the dinosaurs. And now, again, using these blockbusters, these very, very interesting and very appealing fossils that they have access to tell the story of past evolution and extinction. And then by calling attention to one of the greatest extinction moments ever documented that calls attention even to Hollywood producers, they are able to introduce elements that refer to more recent episodes and historical events, and they are able to address evolution from a point of view that is very appealing to most visitors. But I also found this very interesting in the American Museum of Natural History. In this gallery, they are not working with dinosaur fossils, but we are here looking into the whole of advanced mammals and the evolution of horses. So they have a set of horses, skeletons, that typically are very static, may not be as interesting, but it's actually one of the largest collections of horse fossil skeletons in the world. And see what they write here. I'm going to read so as to make no confusion. Since the early 19th, the exhibit has shown a classic linear progression of evolution. Okay, so not interesting at all. But today, the display also offers a more current view of evolution with a complex branching history. So they are doing this for horse specimens. So you can easily transpose this to the human example and to every other example. They are using the materials that they have to create a more authentic and current and up-to-date experience that they then provide to their visitors. And I found this very, very interesting. They also have a lot of materials, so I brought some examples of the materials that they have. They have materials for educators, for teachers that they can easily download, they can use within the museum setting or elsewhere. And they are also working on training courses and workshops. This can be capacitation, they can be available for pre-service, but also in-service teachers and museum explainers, and people who have interest in these topics. Now, something a little bit different, moving from museums to science centers and moving to Science Gallery. We are in Ireland now, and I found this very, very interesting. This is a speculative evolution exhibition. So this is a collaboration between science and artists. Science Gallery is well known for their investment in arts and science and for giving voice to artists that collaborate with scientists to convey messages about science, but in a more, I wouldn't call it artistic way, but in a more emotional way. So here I wouldn't call it, because here science and art are at the same level and they are worked through as equals, hand in hand. So here what the curators invite participants to do is to engage in a speculative simulation of a future ecosystem. So they can envision how, by manipulating variables, how a given ecosystem may evolve and change over time. So calling attention to the impact of our actions in modulating and shaping the world around us, biodiversity in this case. And so they end up addressing concepts of evolution while doing so, which I found very, very interesting. So these are just some examples. I would like to call attention also, and thinking about the way in which evolution education is infused in the vision and mission of these institutions. Also networks. As Patricia mentioned, I am now a representative of the European Network of Museum and Science Centers. I'm the president of the board of EvoKE, and I'm very proud to say that within EXIDE regulations, we do have a statement on evolution. So this is infused in the core of EXIDE actions and making it clear that there's room, that should be room, for museums and science centers to address specifically and explicitly these issues in their line of action. So just to give you an overview of where I come from and my own museum, the Natural History and Science Museum of the University of Porto, this is another example, but just to show you how we are addressing evolution using, again, arts and science. This is just another example. Here in our mission and also our vision, we present ourselves as a space that seeks to spark curiosity, appreciation, and awareness of life and evolution. So again, evolution clearly mentioned in our vision and also in our mission. So we present ourselves as an institution that aims to advance the construction and dissemination of knowledge about evolution and diversity in the convergence between the natural and the cultural worlds. I brought our example, but this happens increasingly in an increasingly bigger number of museums and science centers and cultural institutions around the world. So the way in which this museum is organized, we have a main building in which we have historical and new collections, and then we have a hall of biodiversity. It's a science center that sits within the botanical garden. It is fully devoted to biodiversity, but presented according to an evolutionary point of view. And we also have in mind the possibility of refurbishing an aquarium, allowing us to tell the story of the origin of life on Earth from the beginning, from the water, and then passing on to all the processes that allow us, not us, but that allow biodiversity to be shaped until we reach a point in which we see a depiction of the diversity of life as we are now able to witness it, foreseeing future scenarios. We are not a big museum. We are a small to medium-sized museum. These are just some numbers to give you an overview of how we are organized. But we are fortunate enough to be settled in a place in which artists lived, and in particular the grandparents of a very famous poet and children's tales writer. It's mandatory reading in Portugal. And so we bring in all these elements to tell stories about life. Just to give you an idea, when you arrive at the Hall of Biodiversity, you are faced with a map. Amongst the trees of the botanical garden, you have a phylogenetic tree that says you are here, you are here, you are a single species amongst the wide diversity of species that exist in the world. Then you go inside and you are presented with these observations and aphorisms. This is a project from a multidisciplinary team, but that was envisioned by George Wagensberg, which was a theoretical physicist, friends with artists, including Salvador Dali, but in love, completely in love by life, that allowed us to bring in this idea of aphorisms and metaphors. We, like other museums, do use real objects from our collections to tell these stories, but we try to bring the notion that life in itself is spectacular. We address issues that refer to the Anthropocene, to human pressure in the environment, to the way in which we have been shaping also evolution from an artificial point of view, but in a very positive way. I wouldn't say, as much as I did, optimistic, because our idea is to call attention to the role that humans have as both targets of change, as biological units that are subject to the same evolutionary forces that shape everything that surrounds us, every living being in our planet that has ever existed, that will ever exist, but also as shapers of change. Ever since we started domesticating plants and animals, we invented agriculture. Ever since we started changing the world around us, we are also shaping change. And in that sense, in that capacity, we should be committed to have an increasingly higher responsibility in the way we intervene and impact the world around us. So these are just some pictures. As you see in the beginning of the presentation, I also brought some pictures of the Hall of Biodiversity, and just to show you how this is a part of the museum, but in itself, it's a science center, so it's independent, autonomous, and everything from natural selection to sexual selection to artificial selection, domestication, as we are seeing here, is tailored. Even the garden outside, we can tell stories of the evolution of plants, as I mentioned for other examples. Everything is worked through according to an evolutionary perspective. And this comes through our programming as well. So, of course, you are all invited to visit the Hall of Biodiversity and the Botanical Garden and to confirm by yourselves if I'm saying the truth or not. So we are doing very much what our partners in Portugal, in Europe, and across the world are doing. We are trying to engage our participants with the natural and the cultural worlds, to induce and to foster questioning, to allow them to learn by experimenting using SSI, STSC, and STEAM techniques. We are trying to bridge and expand the formal learning that takes place in school. We also provide authenticity, of course, and this idea of returning to nature, as you saw in some of the studies I highlighted, is the idea of being again immersed in nature, understanding that humans are not independent beings that have detached themselves from nature. We are just a part of it, even though we live in our very urban, most of us, some of us, not really, but the ones who do live in these urban ecosystems, again, sometimes we need to make an effort in returning to nature, but it is important that we do so. We try as much as possible to spark curiosity and to seek for answers. And evolution allows us to do this. Develop critical thinking and creativity. These are examples, for instance, these kids are looking into examples of strategies that animals have to escape their predators and to still be able to prey and to feed. And so, again, from an evolutionary point of view, we address these adaptations. We do not avoid having fun, and so enjoyment is a relevant part in a museum. We, like other museums and science centers, this is a concept and a solution that we have been working into, trying to associate conceptual learning and conceptual and cognitive benefits that arrive that are emerging from the interaction with culture and with knowledge and with diverse contents, try to associate them with a positive experience that creates this need to engage in lifelong learning, which is also very important for a field like evolution that increasingly is impacting on our lives. I mean, it's always impacting, but we are finding new ways in which it impacts. And starting from an early age, okay? Doing activities inside the museum and out, and using the museums as spaces for the participants themselves to co-create with us new exhibitions, new programs, and teach us how actually they want to learn about these issues, okay? And of course, trying to encourage the pursuit of scientific careers. I wouldn't say that our goal is to create a new generation of evolutionary biologists, but if we are able to do so, we will be most happy. Trying as much as possible, again, to blur the lines and the distinctions between different areas of knowledge, and then celebrating initiatives that are very popular around the world, like for instance Darwin Day. This is an example of this year's last year's celebration, but this year we did it again. You cannot read it if you don't read Portuguese, but trust me, and you can see Darwin. This was celebration of Darwin Day, and you can see by the references that here, for instance, we were talking about sexual selection. Here, these are just examples of activities that were developed by interns, high school interns that we have working with us in the museum. And they were the ones producing contents about evolution and then enacting workshops about evolution to work with other participants. And programs that allow, in this case, young children from 5 to 15 years old to engage in the life of the museum and to work with us in co-creating this content. So summing up, science centers and museums are important platforms to foster evolution education, and they employ diverse strategies to engage their visitors and also to address misconceptions. Sorry, and while evidence does show positive impacts on knowledge, interest, acceptance, we need further research, and we still need innovative approaches and diverse approaches, namely involving collaboration and community building around these topics, aiming to maximize our impact and our influence, of course. So I will shut up now, but I will welcome, I don't know if we have time for questions, but if we do, and if you want to, we can carry on this discussion elsewhere, online, or in person on site, if you have the chance to visit us. Thank you.
Hey, thank you so much, and especially for inviting us all to visit your museum.
Of course.
Would be really great, especially because we have next year we have our upcoming EvoKE meeting in Portugal, so it's probably like not so far-fetched to visit your museum while doing so, or doing them after the meeting or before the meeting. Thank you very much for your interesting talk. So I have a couple of questions. So the first one is a very short one. So can you explain to me what Cheddar Man is? It was just in one of the slides in one of the museums of the United Kingdom.
Shadow Man.
Cheddar, like the cheese. I was like wondering what what that might be. Like what?
Let me check. The I'm not entirely sure that I know how to answer you.
Okay,
The
then I'll
Shadow Man.
just look it up myself.
Sorry for that.
Hey, don't worry. But I found it really interesting. So that one of the exhibitions is called Chatterman. So yeah, just wondering. So the other one. So thank you very much, especially for like giving us the overview of all these studies that already have been conducted in science museums. To
I've noticed. Sorry.
Don't worry.
I figured it out. So, Cheddar Man, like
Yes,
like the
like
cheese,
the cheddar
exactly.
cheese, right?
Yeah. He's one of the. It's a skeleton, a human remain found in Great Britain, and one of the oldest. So they built the exhibition and that concept around that specimen that was retrieved from a local region there. Yeah.
Okay, okay, okay. I have to check it out
And
at some
because the
point.
name is cool, it calls attention. So
That's true. Yeah, at least it caught my attention.
yeah,
Um, yeah, and thank you for the overview of all these studies that were conducted in science museums and show how people learn in science museums about evolution. Are you aware of any like literature review about this, or are you considering writing one yourself? Because
I would love to. That would be probably material for a PhD or even a master student. There are some reviews, but they are incomplete, so they don't focus on evolution all in all. There are a lot of material on phylogenetic trees and the way in which they are represented. There's even dissertations and some review articles on the way in which, for instance, whale evolution has been portrayed. So usually they tend to focus on specific topics and are not as inclusive or broad as one as I showed you here, for instance. I was just calling attention to different examples. But yes, that's a good idea. That's a very interesting idea.
yeah, I mean, we
Yeah,
would
yeah,
probably all be happy to either participate or to contribute or to read it
yeah.
as soon as it's published. So
Because there's a lot
hope
of
they did.
great work being conveyed in preparing these exhibitions and these programs. And so it would be very, very relevant to, and some of them, as you saw, they actually have research data. So in some cases, we do have some assessment of the outcomes of implementing these initiatives or the visitor's experience. So it would be very nice to retrieve this data and to organize it. Yeah.
Yeah, especially to see like what works and where are like potential like how would we say like stepping stones or like
Exactly.
difficulties. Yeah, that would be
Yeah.
really interesting to
Yeah.
yeah
You're completely right.
review the like put everything together. Patricia, do you have a question, or shall I just continue?
Well, I can do one question. Maybe it's kind of related with this idea of the literature review. I was wondering if there is any evolution or any topic of evolution or key concept that it's not being approached through an exhibition, or that is more challenging to explore through an exhibition, or if you feel that.
That there maybe the idea of randomness, and it's a more difficult concept to grasp. But even though I don't have references, sometimes you cannot find things online. I've seen exhibits addressing risk perception that then goes on to elements that have to do with randomness. And so, not entirely sure that this has been fully explored, but there's potential there, I would say. And then it's the human example. Even though we have a lot of exhibitions on human evolution and increasingly good exhibitions that allow to expand the concept that we still have a lot of classic depictions of human evolution. So it's not a matter of having enough material, it's more a matter of knowing if the material that we do have is up to date with current knowledge. Because, the difficulty, the most amazing and impressive and sometimes challenging difficulty is to revamp and reorganize an exhibition, because there's a lot of there's a lot of investment, even from a financial point of view, in creating an exhibition. And so changing it may not be straightforward, but sometimes it's very, very important to do so, especially if you think that some visitors will, when visiting a museum, will only go to that specific museum, and that may be the only example of a representation of human evolution, or any sort of evolution, the dimension of evolution that they encounter. So yes, I would say around these two topics, so.
Thank you.
Because the idea of transposing evolution to everyday life concepts, I think museums are becoming increasingly more competent in doing so, because this is something that is being done for all topics. So they are doing the same for evolution.
Yeah. Yeah, I can imagine that it must be really difficult, especially when we look at like how you mentioned like threshold concepts like randomness, or even because in natural history museums we a lot of the time find like one specimen as like a portrait of the whole species, and then we very quickly come to transformationist views or essentialist views, and it's so hard because it costs so many resources to like depict the variation, and so like I feel like it's probably really hard to depict even like microevolution and instead of macroevolution, and I'm
and that's another thing that I remembered. It's also, which is studied, is the capacitation of museum explainers, because sometimes, and communicators and educators, sometimes we are the ones inducing misconceptions, and this is described, and it's a challenge, because you may have the perfect exhibition, but then you are trying to convey a given message and you are using metaphors and establishing comparisons, and sometimes people aren't, because you know what you want to say, but the way in which you are telling it, the story won't be understood the same way as you would like it to. And so you may be inducing some misconceptions. I was thinking when you mentioned using a specimen to depict of course, sometimes we do so, and then people are under the impression that that happens always the same, and so we are the ones inducing misconceptions. So this is also important. It's not just the physical environment.
I can imagine, because we also have research about how adults shape explanations, or even teachers or pre-service teachers create instructional explanations, and a lot of time like anthropomorphisms or metaphors are thought to be very engaging and maybe motivating. So they have like some educate or like pedagogical value, but then they can also inflict misconceptions. And I guess it's like a really fine line, and also like especially when you use anthropomorphisms, because a lot of the time they're really like really funny or like engaging, and then of course you probably get the feedback like, oh, like
Yeah.
people are having more fun when I do it in an anthropomorphized way.
Yeah.
It's a hard word.
Or the function. This insect has wings. Why? Because it needs to, or it, and we know that this isn't exactly the case. And so sometimes we are the ones directing our visitors' reasoning. The same research that is being carried out for formal settings and even for other outlets, say newspapers and social media. So the same kind of research can be applied to museums because, again, you have the person's element. There's people there and people are interacting. So anything that you can grasp, you can explore in a museum setting. It's the same.
Yeah. Okay. Hey, I would call it a day now. Thank you so much again for joining us and for sharing your knowledge and your expertise with us. We were really happy to have you here and hope that you have a wonderful week.
You too. Thank you very much once again. It was a pleasure, and I will stay tuned for the next webinars.
Yeah,
So,
please do so. To meet
of
Christian.
course.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye.
See you soon.
Bye.